Vlad III is much more commonly known as Vlad the Impaler, and for good reason. He is thought to be the inspiration for the original Dracula character, but more importantly, he is also considered one of the most important rulers of Wallachia, and he is considered a hero to many Romanians. From his difficult childhood and being thrown into power, to his gruesome intimidation tactics, all the way to the end of his rule and his life. On today's top 10 list, I'll be covering 10 true scary stories about Vlad the Impaler. Starting up this list in our number 10 spot, we have being held captive. It really does only make sense that we would start this story as close to the beginning as possible. In 1442, Vlad, his younger brother, and their father all went on a mission to the Ottoman Empire. They ended up being captured, and their father was allowed to be released on the condition that the boys stayed behind as collateral and to prove that their father would abide by Ottoman policies. The boys were held for 5 years, and while they learned there, they were also apparently subject to beatings and torture, which is truly what led to the beginning of Vlad's hatred for the Ottomans. But his younger brother actually ended up being more on the opposing side after this experience. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. In our number 9 spot today, we have his first time in power. Vlad first became ruler at only the age of 17, but it was under some pretty horrific circumstances. Vlad's father was the ruler, but he was assassinated, which obviously must have been extremely difficult for Vlad. He actually wasn't the first heir to the throne after his father's passing, however, as he had an older brother. But in a very sad turn of events, his brother was also killed, and in an unbelievably horrific way. Apparently, he was first blinded with hot pokers, and then he was buried alive. I can't believe that things like this used to happen, you guys. That is truly next level messed up. Apparently, this happened while Vlad was still in captivity, but after his release, he was eventually put on the throne for the very first time, but only for a few months. He wouldn't see this position again until 8 years later, but his second ruling is where most of these stories truly come from. And it was a thing that was only done in the privacy of their own homes. Okay, that seems like a fair explanation that we should all be able to chat about and find some kind of common ground, right? Well, obviously not, because Vlad decided to take this whole thing about 10 steps further. He decided to help them ensure that their caps would never come off by having them nailed to their heads. Seems like things went a little too far on that day, but maybe that's just my own opinion. In our number 7 spot today, we have his Impaling Practices. Okay, so you obviously are going to get the name Vlad the Impaler for a reason, right? They usually don't just hand out the impaler part for no good reason. He certainly was known for impaling people, but mostly it was about how awful he was about it. Like, more awful than just regular old impaling people. So basically, a victim would be tied up with a horse on each side for stability. Not sure why the horses needed to be involved, but that's okay. They would then have a stake driven up through them from the bottom, with the end result being it coming up and out through their mouth. Okay, so that sounds terrible, but here's the worst part. The stake would only be semi-sharp. This is because if it was too sharp, then the victim would die right away, and then how could Vlad have any fun at all? Yeah, I told you. It was more awful than regular, and you didn't believe me. Another one of his impaling strategies was that he would just have them impaled through the chest or stomach area so that they could then be posted throughout the city as a warning to others. I could not make this up if I tried. In our number 6 spot today, we have his Intimidation Tactics. Okay, so Vlad liked to display a lot of the people that he impaled. I'm not even gonna ask why, because this guy is clearly a little messed up. There's something that was once called the Forest of Impaled. This is when he would line the roads with tons and tons of Turkish soldiers that he had impaled. Apparently this was an intimidation tactic, but I also think that maybe he just liked doing messed up things, but that is just me editorializing. Apparently another intimidation tactic he used was when he would place all the impaled people around a city that he had been targeting. They would be on spears of different heights, and the higher the height, the higher they ranked in their life. I feel like this would be a pretty sufficient intimidation tactic for me. I feel like it absolutely gets the message across pretty clearly. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Deadly Raid. In 1462, Vlad was busy raiding the southern banks of Danube, and of course it was extremely gruesome and very deadly. Apparently he explained that they were just killing everyone they came across, and that they counted 23,884 deaths, but that didn't include those who had burned in the homes that they set ablaze, or those who had their heads chopped off by the soldiers. So yeah, it was pretty brutal. After this raid, it is said that the soldiers brought back gifts to Vlad, but of course it couldn't have just been a handful of daisies and a box of chocolates. Instead, it was a sack of heads and noses and ears that they had chopped off. Vlad, of course, loved this extremely obscure gift as it allowed him to re-gift them to other rulers as a warning of just what he was capable of. In our number 4 spot today, we have revenge. So remember earlier when I was talking about how his family was killed when he was quite young, and not to mention how he was held captive for all those years? Well, after enduring all of this, he certainly already had a taste for brutality, and he was sure to get his revenge. Once in power for the second time, he decided to host a little soiree. He held a banquet where he invited hundreds of members of rival families. I feel like I would have politely declined because that certainly seems suspicious, but that did not happen. Vlad had all of the older nobles impaled at this dinner party. He then took the remaining guests and apparently had them march to the remains of the castle in the mountains, where he then forced them to rebuild it. I guess he certainly did get revenge for his father and for his brother. In our number 3 spot today, we have the gruesome retreat. In 1462, Vlad was retreating from battle, but he knew that the Ottoman forces were encroaching on him and his army. This is what led him to order that the 20,000 defeated Ottomans be impaled on wooden stakes just outside of the city, so as to deter the forces from continuing to pursue. He ordered the mass killing of 20,000 people at one time. Of course, when Sultan Mehmed II saw this horrific sight, he decided that it was best if they decided to retreat to Constantinople. It was through this very smart but extremely horrid move that he ended up escaping the capture of the Ottomans that day, but he did end up getting captured shortly after this by Hungarian forces. In our number 2 spot today, we have Vlad's first wife. This is a story that has less to do with Vlad and more to do, well, actually everything to do with his first wife. In 1462, the Turkish army was coming to raid the castle, and this was actually being led by Vlad's half-brother. When it became apparent that the Turkish army was extremely close, Vlad's wife at the time made quite a dark and scary decision. She said that she would rather have her body be eaten by the fish than to be led into captivity, and this is what led her to jump out of the window of the castle into the body of water below. Because of this insanely sad story, the river is now referred to as the Ladies' River. In our number 1 spot today, we have Vlad's death. Vlad ended up being exiled for a while before his third go at the throne. He eventually did win back his power, but it was sadly very short-lived. In 1476, as he was marching to battle again with the Ottomans, he and the people he was with ended up being ambushed, and this is when he was killed. This is obviously sad, but it certainly isn't uncommon for these times, but it's the story that came afterwards that really ends this off on a dark note. It is said that when he was killed, the enemies then cut off his head and preserved it in honey and sent it over to Istanbul. In Istanbul, the Sultan ended up displaying Vlad's head on none other than a stake. Quite a dark ending for Vlad, for sure. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye!